Yeah, so Chinese martial arts before the Boxer Uprising, so before 1900, was it looked the same, but it was somewhat of a different animal because it always incorporated religion and theater. The martial arts and religion and theater were a single subject. It's a little bit hard to understand initially, but when you understand what its function was in society, it becomes quite obvious. So the first thing to know about Chinese martial arts is that it was part of theater, and theater was everywhere. Theater was anywhere you went, you were going to encounter theater. It was it was happening all the time. It was in the street. Temples were in fact theaters, and there were an enormous number of temples in China. If you think about it, every block had a temple. They were just everywhere. And even small villages, 20, 30 temples. And those temples were, not all of them, but most temples had a stage, or their courtyard functioned as a stage for theater or ritual. And there were also processional rituals that happened in the street, went from one place to another, went from one village to another. There were also street performers who engaged in storytelling and acrobatics. There was even fighting as entertainment in the street. And you also had these technology where you could take bamboo and tie it together into simple or incredibly elaborate theaters that would go up in a day or two. And they'd stay up for a month and then they'd take them down. And there were traveling theater companies everywhere. Uh, Besides professional theater, there was an enormous amount of amateur theater. In fact, almost everybody knew how to perform some part of a play, either were able to recite it or perform it. And the physical performance of the play was martial arts. They were the same thing. It was a physical theater. So you would do martial arts, you'd stop in a pose, and you'd sing a song, and the word, in fact, pose in Chinese doesn't mean to hold still. It means to take on a certain character. It's literally what it means. The other thing to understand is that all of the characters in the theater were dead in the sense that they were gods or demons. In fact, the name for an actor um, was Guishan, which means ghost god. So the roles in all of the traditional plays were all, heroes of the past or gods who had become heroes, or heroes who had become gods, or ghosts. Um, a ghost in Chinese culture is someone who uh, uh, isn't completely dead, essentially. It's not a materialistic world where there's a material realm and a spirit realm. There's a bit of you still alive if you're a ghost. So that's why you can invoke them in spirit rituals and transmediumship, or what we call possession in the West. This kind of, it just a person could become the god because the gods are still there. So theater was, whether you were amateur or professional, theater was an invocation of the gods on the stage. So there was always this possibility that the god was present. In fact, the way traditional theater worked is you would actually take the gods out of the temple in a procession, carry the statues, that is, to the theater, set them up in seats, and then show them a play of themselves performing on the stage as entertainment for the gods. In fact, theater was called literally entertainment for the gods. So these theater rituals were everywhere, and they were extremely important. They functioned essentially as a kind of local government. Everyone sort of thinks, oh, Chinese culture, like there was an emperor and then there were these magistrates. But there was like one magistrate for a huge region. In fact, local government was actually run by headmen or councils, and they organized, the way they raised money was through putting on operas. They'd get a prescription for, if they need to repair a bridge, they'd put on an opera, and then people would give money to that. And so they also functioned as a kind of situation for mutual aid, or for teaching history, for transmitting ethics, for communal projects. And of course, they then functioned to create militias. So it's a really strange idea if you don't build it up from the ground, that that theater was used for creating militias, but in fact it was. And that's not fundamentally so different than the way it worked in Africa, because dance was used to create militias too. The word militia is, you know, perhaps a war party, right? But what we're talking about here when we talk about militias is uh, a group of soldiers, a group of villagers with spears capable of fighting off bandits, roving, maybe a few thousand bandits roving the countryside who would come and raid your village. So you needed a militia to ward them off. In fact, they would say, there's a traditional saying, in order to defend a village, you need a drum and a gong, as you can see behind me. And because you would set up a theatrical militia, and each person, probably the way it worked is each person or each platoon represented a character from the opera. So that the opera itself was a ritual that implied the order of command. And so these operas, these long, complex operas, were extremely important for social function. Wars were also, small-scale wars, what we might call tit-for-tat wars, happened between villages. And it's just, human culture. They would fight each other. They were pretty minor. Not maybe only one or two people would die. Maybe nobody would die. But the war would then end with an exchange of brides. Right. So it was.
So this form, it just permeated all of Chinese culture. It was
Yeah.
impossible to not participate.
Yes.
But it was also, as the Boxer Rebellion sort of started simmering, it was also a way of training soldiers, training the resistance. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that is also completely strange, perhaps foreign, is this idea of, how do you train a soldier in this kind, especially how do you train a militia soldier? And one of the ways was through spirit possession. And spirit possession wasn't the single thing. There are many different degrees of ways in which you could be helped by the gods. One was a ritual where everyone just, you could say, believed or agreed that the gods were fighting up in the sky on your behalf against the gods of the other village, or of the demons, or sorry, the bandits. So there were many different rituals that invoked martial prowess. And it's not so different than the concept of othering. We have, you have to make the enemy evil to get the average soldier to want to kill, right? So you have to tell stories about how the enemy is evil. The Chinese had it reversed. They had told stories about how they were so great, right? So they're superior to their enemies because the gods are on their side. Yes. We also had this. Uh, so I could talk a little bit about the Boxer Uprising and uh, how it started. The Boxer Uprising. If you ask the average uh, you know historian, the first thing they're going to tell you is that most of the boxers were just hungry teenagers. There were famines. It was a tough time, and they were looking for someone to blame. And at that time, uh, Christians, particularly Protestant Christians, but Christians in general, had a slight advantage socially. After the Opium Wars, they had access through their representatives in the embassies to the imperial court, something local people had no such thing. They were also anti opera or anti theater. Why? Because the gods were on the stage. So if you wanted to be a Christian or even get Christian charity, you had to not participate in the theater. And it's amazing when you start to understand what the missionary movement was. Uh, we Americans sent large numbers of single female missionaries who were mostly Methodists, often working with the YMCA, to China. And their main goals were to set up hospitals and schools. And they quickly set on the idea of getting rid of foot binding, getting rid of eunuchs, getting rid of opium, and spreading education, health. That this is how they functioned. They eventually became what we would call secular. Those types of missionaries over the next 40 years, they were really a kind of like NGOs, and they. But in the early days, they were spreading trains. They were, essentially they were access point because everybody was a little bit Christian from the West. They were access point to trains and telegraphs, which the Chinese people generally wanted. Um, but these were putting people out of work. Obviously, anybody who carried stuff, anybody who was a porter, was being put out of work by trains. And there were people called runners. This was a particular job in China that they did a whole bunch of different things. One was deliver messages, one was carry important people around, and another one was administer warrants. So they were generally martial artists and generally had martial skills. And they would go capture people for the magistrate and bring them before them for judgment. And so runners were being completely put out of work by telegraphs and trains, and so were caravan guards. And caravan guards were also trained martial artists. They moved things that were of value, and I'm going to talk about them a little later. But basically, they were all martial artists, and they blamed the Christians, but all foreign things. They were basically against trains and telegraphs and foreign things that were anti-opera. And so what they did, they organized and they used rituals to put that of possession, where they became in their own minds or in the experience of people around them, they became the gods of the theater. So Nejia was one of those important gods. So was Guanggong, the god of loyalty and war. Um, so was the Monkey King, Sun Wukong. Uh, and there were many, 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 many opera gods that people became. And so when you would join these kind of militias, these boxer militias, you would do a ritual and you would become one of these gods. And then whenever you went into battle, they'd do the ritual again. And they set out to kill all Chinese Christians and expel foreigners from the country, sort of their stated beliefs. And they destroyed trains and they destroyed telegraphs. And then they went into Beijing, and there was this flip-flopping. The central government opposed them and then supported them because the government was kind of weak because princes had different opinions about how the government should be run. And so they flip-flopped. And at one point, they supported the Boxers as the Boxers were attacking the foreign embassies. And uh, so this created a siege event. And all of the foreign embassies asked for help from each other, in fact. I'm sure the British were asking for German troops that might be nearby. And this triggered the invasion of 9 foreign armies.